Those adventures of yours had better be plenty grand," Lydia had teased, bringing a handkerchief to the corner of her eye. The words had been in jest, but her tears were real. "Oh, they will be," Beatrice had said, kissing her finger and crossing her heart. "I promise." And then she too required the aid of a handkerchief. Although she knew Lydia would be fine on her own, she still worried about her. Over the years, certain women in Stony Point had been awfully pointed in their opinions about the way Lydia had chosen to raise her. In recent days, they'd been quick to play Cassandra, predicting all manner of misfortunes for Beatrice, seduction, illness, injury, and so on, spurred by their disdain for Lydia's liberal attitudes and their shock at her audacity in letting her niece go. Beatrice couldn't wait to prove them wrong. 8:40 to 8:45, goodbyes. "I'm not one for lengthy farewells," Lydia had announced as she stood next to Beatrice on the front porch. Slipping her hand in her pocket, she pulled out a lovely silver brooch and pinned it to the collar of Beatrice's coat. "What's this?" Beatrice had asked, turning the edge of her lapel so she could examine it. The brooch contained a beautiful striped feather encased in a delicate oval of glass. "It's a wren's feather," Lydia had answered, "for protection and luck. Your father gave it to your mother on the occasion of your birth. She thought it so precious that she rarely wore it. She gave it to me before she died and asked that I give it to you on a special occasion. Your wedding, perhaps, or the birth of your first child." "Maybe we should wait until then," Beatrice had said. "Maybe you should keep it for me a little while longer?" "No," Lydia had responded with great firmness. "Today's the day." Fearing she might cry, Beatrice bowed her head and turned away, thinking how hard goodbyes were, even when you knew they weren't forever. Lydia had taken great pains to keep her away from her parents in their last days, and although Beatrice no longer harbored hard feelings toward her aunt over the matter, losing the chance to say goodbye to them had left a mark on Beatrice's heart. Within that mark, dark and deep, lay Beatrice's biggest fear, that one day, when the balance of the life she'd lived with her parents inevitably tipped toward her life without them, all her memories of their time together, precious and irreplaceable, would be lost. "Thank you," she'd whispered to Lydia as she'd given the woman's hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll cherish it always." 8:45 to 9 o'clock. Stagecoach to Stony Point Station. The stage had been on time, the ride uneventful. Beatrice hadn't brought any trunks to stow, and they'd made no stops for other passengers. Lydia had kindly offered to send along anything she might need from home once she was settled, and with that in mind, Beatrice had packed only one extra dress, blue calico with velvet trim, a dressing gown, a pair of felt slippers, a cotton chemise, 3 hair ribbons, red, yellow, and blue, a hairbrush, a light shawl, an assortment of unmentionables, 5 handkerchiefs, 2 lace, 3 cotton, needles and thread, a bar of lavender soap, a tin of pins, pen and ink, pencils and paper, her diary of observations, and the latest issue of Madame Morrow's Strange Tales of Gotham to read on the train. Everything was neatly stowed inside a sturdy carpet-bag that Lydia had given her. In preparation for the day's travel, Beatrice had pulled her hair into a long braid and donned a practical but comely dress of dark green broadcloth, along with black patent leather boots, a light plaid ulsterette, and her favorite straw hat. She felt her ensemble accentuated her youth without coming across as too naive. The last thing she wanted was to appear fresh off the boat. She'd read enough of Madame Morrow's tales to know what happened to girls like that. As an extra precaution, she'd sewn most of the money she'd saved for the trip into the hem of her petticoat. It wasn't much, sufficient for a couple nights' lodging and a ticket back to Stony Point, if it came to that, but she couldn't afford to lose it. When the stagecoach had reached the station, she'd carefully handed over what she owed the driver, including a modest tip, and then proceeded to the ticket booth with plenty of time to spare. Or so she'd thought. Sitting on the bench now, she considered her next step. Should she wait for a train that might never arrive? Should she give up and go home? If only she'd come to the station earlier. She'd barely slept all night and had been ready to leave by sunrise. Still, she'd wanted to give Lydia a last morning together. She'd figured that by taking the 9:30 train, she'd still be able to get to the tea shop before the appointed hour and maybe even be the first in line. How many applicants could there be? She had no idea. All she knew was that the closer she was to the front of the line, the sooner the shopkeeper's search could end, and the sooner her life in the city would start. "Perhaps we could take the steamboat," a gentleman's voice suggested. "There's one that leaves at noon from Grassy Point." Beatrice turned to find that he wasn't speaking to her, but to a woman dressed in a red silk dress whose bonnet was adorned with a matching spray of ostrich feathers. "I guess it will have to do," the lady said, and sighed, the plumes on her bonnet trembling. Figuring the steamboat might have to do for her as well, Beatrice rose to follow them. As they made their way off the platform, a train whistle sounded in the distance. Stopping short, Beatrice waited for it to sound again. The next time the whistle blew, it was somewhat closer, and when she looked down the tracks, she could see a train approaching the station. Rushing to the ticket window, she rapped on the counter to get the station agent's attention. "What's that train?" she demanded. "The New York Central." "When's it set to leave?" 10 a.m., but it's freight only." "Why's it running when the passenger trains aren't?" "Milk, hay, and potatoes don't give a fig if they're on time." Smoke belching from its engine, the train pulled into the station with a string of boxcars hitched behind it. Beatrice picked up her bag and turned to leave, walking past groups of farmhands loading heavy cans of milk and barrels of apples. Just as she was about to exit the station, she noticed a young man who was hefting sacks of potatoes, one after another, into the dark hold of a boxcar. She watched as he loaded the last of his sacks into the car, then exited the platform pushing an empty handcart. Unlike some of the other farmhands at the station, he wasn't going along for the ride. The train's whistle sounded a sharp toot, announcing its departure. As the remainder of the farmhands either joined their freight in their respective boxcars or cleared the platform, Beatrice saw that the door to the car with the potatoes was ajar. She had no idea what the steamboat schedule was on Fridays mid-September, or if she could even get a ticket for a trip to Manhattan. Fueled by determination and her penchant for serendipity, she figured hitching a ride with those potatoes might be her best bet, and perhaps kismet to boot. If she got caught, then so be it, but at least she could say she tried. The pain she felt in her heart when she thought of giving up on the journey was far greater than any fear she had of the unknown. There was no denying the city's allure. She simply had to go. Glancing toward the ticket stand, she picked up her skirts and quickly hoisted herself up through the narrow opening to the boxcar. Heart pounding, she willed the train to leave the station before she was found out. Thankfully, the wait wasn't long. In a matter of seconds, the train was moving through a cloud of smoke and steam, and she was on her way to New York. She spent much of the journey perched atop a heap of potato sacks that she'd managed to arrange in one corner of the dusty hold. It was either that or spend the trip struggling to stand erect as the car wobbled to and fro during its journey along the tracks. Carefully shifting on her burlap seat, Beatrice turned up the collar of her coat and held it around her neck to shield herself from the raw nip of wind coming through the boxcar's door. She'd tried to close it, but it simply wouldn't budge. She longed for warmth and solid ground under her feet, yet she was determined not to succumb to regret. Staring out the open door, she soon became transfixed by the ever-changing view. Moss-green pastures skirted the tracks as they rolled past. Haystacks dotted the land, and a lone dairy cow made its way along a winding path to the water. Had the gentle beast managed to break through the barnyard fence? One could hope. One could pray. One could wish. Closing her eyes, Beatrice remembered a farm she used to visit with her parents when she was a child. Why they'd gone there she couldn't remember, but she did recall the farmer's wife allowing her to feed the chickens and milk their favorite cow. How pleasant it had felt to rest her head against the velvety warmth of the Holstein's flank as she went about the steady grasp and tug of emptying its udders. What she wouldn't give to be back there again, to feel her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder, to hear the farmer's wife sing in time with her work. May you rise with the sun, ready to make hay. May the rains come at night to wash your cares away. May you sleep with the angels sittin' on your bed. May you be an hour in heaven afore the devil knows you're dead. When she opened her eyes, had she slept or merely been lost in reverie, the landscape had changed again. The farms along the river had been replaced by sprawling brick buildings with tall smokestacks. How long had she been on the train? She guessed she'd been traveling for well past an hour. How much longer would it take to get to the city? By passenger train, the trip usually took a little over 2 hours. Was it the same for freight? By the way her belly was rumbling, Beatrice figured it must be close to noon. Taking an apple from her bag, she polished its red skin against the sleeve of her coat, then bit into the fruit's crisp, sweet flesh. It was a Macintosh red, one of the first apples of the season from the vast orchards that surrounded Stony Point. Lydia preferred the late varieties like Asopus Spitzenberg or Winesap. They keep better over winter. But Beatrice had always loved the tart, early fruit best. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. Fingering a few stray coins in her pocket, she wondered if she had enough money to take a carriage to the tea shop once she got off the train. She hadn't had to buy a ticket at the railway station, so she thought she might be able to hire a hack. Her original plan had been to take one of the city's elevated trains to her destination. For a nickel, you could ride from Battery Park to the Harlem River and see the city from 3 stories off the ground. Every 3 minutes, a string of train cars atop one of those tracks rattled from one end of the city to the other. Of course, there was noise and smoke and showers of hot cinders that spewed onto the streets below, and there was always a chance of falling from the platform or getting pushed by the crowds. But 5 cents was a small price to pay for turning hours to minutes, especially if they got her where she needed to go. Tea and Sympathy, 933 Broadway, New York, New York. A map she'd bought at the Stony Point Pharmacy showed the shop was situated near Madison Square Park. Mr. Wheeler, the pharmacist, had given her a sly wink after he'd fetched it for her from behind the counter. "I've been hearing rumors about you," he'd teased. The news of her upcoming departure had spread fast. "They're all true," Beatrice had replied with a sly smile. Pointing to the map, he'd said, "If you're anywhere near Madison Square, you really must visit Lady Liberty's torch. Even without the rest of her attached, it's a truly remarkable sight." Beatrice had begged Lydia many times over to take her to the park to see the grand torch, but her aunt had insisted they wait until the statue was whole and in its rightful place on Bedloe's Island. "For a quarter, you can climb right to the top to have a look around. The view of the Fifth Avenue Hotel is really something from up there, I tell you." "I'll keep that in mind," Beatrice had said, wondering if the rumors of the hotel's haunted corridors were true. Where would she stay if she didn't get the position at the tea shop? She certainly couldn't afford one of the posh, velvet-draped rooms at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. The current issue of Madame Marrow's Strange Tales of Gotham had included a gruesome story about a country lass who'd landed in the city with no place to go. The poor girl had soon gotten lost and wound up being stabbed to death in a dark alley off the Bowery. A street with pits dug into the floors of every beer hall for cockfights and rat-catching matches, and prostitutes plying their trade on every corner. She'd be sure not to make that mistake. But was she being foolish in thinking that she might understand all that was worth knowing about a place simply from reading newspapers, penny dreadfuls, and guidebooks, and from a yearly jaunt with Aunt Lydia to the tamest parts of the city? Had she ever stayed in New York overnight? If she had, she couldn't remember it. But it was too late to turn back now. "I always figured you'd go away someday," Mr. Wheeler had said before they'd parted ways. "To New York, or out west, or maybe London or Paris." "Whatever made you think that?" Beatrice had asked. "You aren't like the other girls in Stony Point. You're not afraid to have an inquisitive mind." His remark had meant quite a lot to her. She had great respect for Mr. Wheeler. He was the one person in town who knew everyone's private business, yet he never divulged anyone's secrets. Pitching her apple core out the open car door, Beatrice thought, I suppose he's right. Mr. Wheeler was the closest thing Stony Point had to a soothsayer. Just then, the car's wheels began to squeal on the tracks, and the train came to a shuddering stop. Sticking her head out the door and looking both ways, Beatrice saw that the city was in sight, but still a ways off in the distance. They most certainly were not at the station. "Clear the tracks!" a man shouted as a great commotion was building outside the train. "Everyone, stand clear!" Climbing out of the car, Beatrice picked her way down a steep, rocky grade to a scrubby patch of grass. A crowd had gathered around the engine, which had stopped just shy of a curious contraption that had been laid over the tracks. Made from massive wood beams that encased a set of iron rails with cannonballs for bearings, it supported an enormous wooden box at one end and a bright red steam engine at the other. A sturdy chain attached the engine to the box, presumably to haul the box across the tracks. Beatrice recognized the odd shape at once. "Cleopatra's Needle," she whispered. "It must be." Glancing around, she saw that indeed they were stopped next to the dockyard on the Hudson where the pontoons had been moored after carrying the needle up the river. One by one, the farmhands who'd been riding along with their goods jumped down from the train, and they all moved to get a better view. "Stand back!" a red-faced man began to shout. His was the same voice that had instructed the crowd to clear the tracks. Beatrice couldn't see past the sack-coated men who now surrounded her, their hats cocked to the backs of their heads, their weathered hands on their hips. When one of the men spat to the side without thinking, his spittle landed on the toe of her boot. He stared at Beatrice and grinned. Dragging her boot across a clump of grass, she thought, "Welcome to city life." "Why are we standing around looking at a box?" the rude man groused. "'Cause a Vanderbilt paid for it," the man next to him answered. "How much? 100,000 smackers?" "You lie." "I don't." "You do. You told me there'd be something to see. That there's just a box." Beatrice found her way past the men to a less crowded spot, where the sound of the steam engine drowned out the men's chatter. The grind of the chain winding on its spool, along with the growling churn of cannonballs tumbling in their channels, caused the ground to shake as the obelisk inched forward. Soon, the terrible sound of metal scraping against metal squealed through the air. Holding her hands over her ears, Beatrice looked on as a man standing atop the obelisk waved a white flag and signaled for the engine to be brought to a stop. A chorus of whoops and hollers erupted from the contraption's crew to celebrate the safe delivery of the needle across the tracks. Atop the roof of a warehouse nearby, two men observed the proceedings. One was a photographer hired by Mr. Vanderbilt to document the obelisk's journey. The other was Mr. Gideon Palsham, a master architect who had a great interest in ancient stone structures and anything said to have been touched by magic. While the photographer stood hunched behind his camera, cloaked in a heavy black cloth, Mr. Palsham caught sight of a young girl below. He watched the girl intently. She was the only female in the crowd, the only one of her kind. Pulling his gold watch from his pocket, he worried his thumb over the magic sigil engraved on its surface. What is she? He wondered, cocking his head and licking his lips. He couldn't quite taste it. As the photographer drew the cover over his lens, the train's whistle sounded, calling its passengers aboard. Beatrice moved with the crowd as it edged past the box that held the obelisk. Who could have imagined that she'd arrive in New York at the same time as this magnificent wonder? Perhaps there was magic in the world after all. Everything she'd read about the monument had pointed to it being an object of untold mystical powers. Slowing her pace as she drew near, she hoped to get a better look at the obelisk. Although it was dressed in wood planking and laid on its side, she couldn't help but feel that she should pause to honor it. The men walking behind her didn't feel the same and were keen to push past. To Beatrice's dismay, one of them nearly knocked her over in his haste. Reaching out to find her balance, she instinctively grabbed hold of the arm of the man standing nearest to her. Flustered and embarrassed, she pulled away from the stranger as soon as she'd found her footing. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to impose."
"It's quite all right,"
the gentleman replied, holding out his arm to protect her from the jostling crowd.
"I'd like to help you if I might."
His skin was the color of nutmeg, and his face was lined with wrinkles as if he'd spent most of life turned toward the sun. He wore no hat, but his graying hair was neatly combed, and his beard came to a jaunty point. Dressed in pin-striped trousers and a double-breasted waistcoat, he held his jacket over his arm. The sleeves of his linen shirt were loosely rolled to his elbows, but the blue silk ascot he wore around his neck was properly tied and fixed with a silver pin in the shape of a scarab. When he smiled, a gold-capped tooth glinted in the corner of his grin, and his dark eyes shone with steadfastness. Although Beatrice hadn't any reason to trust him, she was certain he didn't mean her harm. "Thank you," Beatrice found herself saying as the crowd continued to push on around them.
"This way,"
the gentleman said, leading her to a platform of wooden skids directly beside the obelisk.
"Just until those barbarians pass."
From where she stood, Beatrice could see a team of men going about the business of dismantling the portion of the contraption that still obstructed the tracks. They were making quick work of it, and she was sure the train's conductor wouldn't waste any time once the tracks were clear. "I should be getting back on the train," she said.
"Have you come a long way?"
"Not nearly as far as the obelisk," Beatrice answered with a smile. Patting the side of the box, the man said,
"It has been a long journey."
"Have you traveled with it the entire way?" Beatrice asked.
"I have indeed,"
he replied with a solemn nod. Pointing to a brass handle on the side of the box, he asked,
"Would you like to see it?"
Glancing back at the train, Beatrice shook her head. "I'd love to, but I really must go."
"I won't let them leave without you, I promise. I'll make sure you get where you need to be."
Gently sliding the wooden panel to the left, he revealed a space just large enough for Beatrice to peer through.
"Go on,"
he urged.
"Have a look. It misses being seen."
Beatrice stuck her head inside the box. The space was filled with the smell of damp stone, reminding her of the smooth rocks she'd collected along the Hudson as a child. Standing on tiptoe, she shifted slightly to one side to allow a bit of sunlight to pass into the box. All at once, she could see the rosy, mottled surface of the obelisk. The graceful curve of a glyph was within her reach. She traced it with her fingers. The stone was cool and damp, and when she held her palm against it, she could feel a low, steady pulse. Was it the obelisk? Was it the train's engine preparing to depart? Or was it just her heart, racing with excitement? Giddy with wonder, she let out a soft laugh, which, to her surprise, echoed quite freely inside the dark space. It carried on long after it should have, fading into an eerie, undulating whisper. Closing her eyes, Beatrice leaned forward in an effort to discern its meaning. "By knot of one, my spell's begun. By knot of two, it will come true. By knot of three, so may it be." The words were shockingly clear, terrifyingly enchanting. Not knowing what to think, Beatrice withdrew her head in a fright. The gentleman who'd opened the box for her was gone. In her haste to catch the train, she moved to climb down from the platform on her own. Misjudging the distance, she stumbled and tripped on the hem of her skirts and landed in a heap on the ground. Her world went sideways, then black. The last thing she heard was the sound of coins tumbling out of her petticoat, cheerily ringing as they lost themselves among the planks and stones. The Organist. Mrs. Penelope Piddock rang the doorbell to the parsonage of the Church of the Good Shepherd. She was there to deliver a basket of comforts to the resident preacher, Reverend Francis Townsend. A loaf of bread, a few ripe pears, some fresh pipe tobacco, the Reverend did love his pipe, and a batch of homemade chicken soup. She was also there to collect whatever tract, card, or broadsheet he wished to have printed so the Ladies' Bible Society could distribute copies during the group's weekly promenade through Madison Square Park. Most often they were slips of colored paper with Bible verses printed on one side and the church's service times on the reverse. The curtains were drawn, the front window shuttered, so she couldn't see into the house, but she figured he must be there since he'd recently taken ill. When the Reverend didn't respond to the bell, she took the door's heavy brass knocker in her hand and gave 3 loud raps. After another long minute of waiting, during which she distinctly heard footsteps drawing near, the door finally opened, albeit only halfway.
"Good morning, Sister Piddock,"
the Reverend said, brow sweaty, cheeks flushed. The tall, imposing man looked down on his parishioner with watery, bloodshot eyes. His jacket was rumpled, his collar limp, and he appeared to be dreadfully short on sleep. "Good morning, Reverend," the woman replied, her voice laden with concern. "I trust you're on the mend?" The last time she'd stopped by the parsonage, he'd opened the peephole only long enough to say he was under the weather. That was 3 days ago, so she'd assumed he'd be feeling better by now. She'd been hoping he might invite her in for refreshments and conversation. She wouldn't keep him long, of course, just long enough to discuss a few pressing matters that were on her mind. Chief among them, the goings-on at a nearby tea shop, where she suspected strange practices were afoot.
"Can I help you?"
the preacher curtly asked, ignoring her question. Poor man, Sister Piddock thought. He's muddled with fever. It was all she could do not to place the palm of her hand against his forehead to confirm her diagnosis. In the years since he'd taken the post at the church, she'd never seen him looking so careworn and tired. "I should be asking that of you," she chirped as she offered up the basket. "It's nothing extravagant, mind you, just a few things to cheer you." The Reverend reluctantly peered into the basket. Spying the pouch of tobacco, his eyes lit up.
"That's very thoughtful of you, Sister,"
he said, gamely taking the parcel in hand.
"I'm sure your kindness will have me feeling better in no time."
Sister Piddock beamed. Giving her a friendly nod, the Reverend made to shut the door.
"Well, if you'll excuse me—"
Sister Piddock stopped him short. "I know that you've been unwell, but have you anything you wish we ladies to distribute during this week's rounds through the park?"
"Oh, yes, of course,"
he muttered, shaking his head.
"I nearly forgot. Wait here while I fetch it. I'll be just a moment."
Basket in hand, he disappeared inside the dark house. Sister Piddock couldn't help but feel that the good preacher was acting odd. It must be the fever. Normally, he was quite accommodating toward her, sometimes even inviting her to join him in his study to share her thoughts on his notes for the week's sermon. It fell to her to receive his notes early so she could pick out the proper hymns for the service. She took great pride in choosing just the right music to best support his homilies. A few of the congregants, well, one congregant not so long ago had complimented her on her talents, saying, "Your playing proves the maxim true. Music does indeed soothe the savage breast." The man had then presented her with a lovely hymnal, the likes of which she'd never seen. "These particular settings of psalms are quite old," he'd told her, "but I believe you'll find the melodies stirring." And indeed she had. Reverend Townsend had enjoyed them as well, and often left the services humming one of their tunes. He'd even recognized a few of them as favorites of his grandfather, who, by the Reverend's account, had been an inspired preacher with a beautiful voice who'd brought many followers into the fold. In recent days, Sister Piddock had been especially mindful to support the Reverend's work any way she could. She extended her devotion willingly and obsessively to him. The woman lacked affection in her life, from her husband, her friends, her relations, her dog, so she'd placed her attentions elsewhere, giving all her energies to God's work. This had caused her to feel satisfied and pleased, and at times quite euphoric, especially when she compared herself with other women of her class. Oh, what temptations the city held for a lady of leisure. Fashion, sweets, literature, music, gossip, gambling. Thank heavens for the Reverend and his wise counsel. Aside from her post as organist and leading the Ladies' Bible Society, she'd taken it upon herself to investigate just what was happening at Tea and Sympathy. After hearing rumors about the pair of women who resided above the place, one who made potions, one who practiced palmistry, she'd stationed herself outside the shop door to watch their comings and goings and to spy through the windows. She'd been shocked to see a rather large bird, a raven, she guessed, always hopping about the place, doing as it pleased. How menacing, how unsanitary. Such creatures were known to carry all manner of disease. The woman who saw to brewing the tea didn't seem all that strange, a little dowdy perhaps, and a bit unkempt. Of course, the act of drinking tea was, in and of itself, quite troublesome, as it had been known to lead to all sorts of sins: idleness, gossip, political activity, subversive thinking. But by and large, it was the other woman who worked at the shop who was of most concern to Sister Piddock. Day after day she sat at a table adorned with all manner of mystical trappings and turned cards or read palms for any number of callers. Although the strange woman dressed like a proper lady, her face was gruesomely disfigured, and she had only one eye. Had the bird pecked it out? Sister Piddock hadn't dared to step foot inside the place, not yet, but she'd stayed out in front of the shop for hours at a time to observe the poor souls who'd fallen victim to the proprietress's machinations. And oh, the things those women said when they came out of the shop. They raved of miracles, cures, potions, magic, womb regulators, aphrodisiacs. From the way they spoke, you'd think, well, how could she not suspect the place was run by witches? A few of the women returned to the shop daily, as if under a spell. She hadn't any proof of it, of course. How did one go about proving someone a witch? Witchcraft or not, she'd thought she might do well to share her suspicions with another godly man, Mr. Anthony Comstock of the Society for the Suppression of Vice. His name was frequently in the papers alongside detailed accounts of his many great victories in stamping out sin. Prayer was always the best and first course of action, but she was sure Mr. Comstock would appreciate being made aware of the situation. As she waited for the Reverend to return, she began composing a letter to him in her mind. Dear Mr. Comstock, it has come to my attention that the proprietresses of the shop known as Tea and Sympathy, 933 Broadway, may well be engaged in questionable activities that fall under your jurisdiction and concern.
Here it is,
the Reverend said, handing a sheet of foolscap over to Sister Piddock.
I'd like 500 broadsheets, double the usual amount.
Sister Piddock gave a solemn nod. Staring at the page, she felt her resolve strengthen. There's something I've been meaning to speak with you about, she said, hoping to gain the preacher's counsel on how best to proceed. With a dry cough and a quick glance over his shoulder, Reverend Townsend responded with a frown.
Perhaps another time.
Yes, of course, Sister Piddock replied, feeling terribly guilty for keeping him as long as she had. Will you be joining us in the park on Saturday evening? Perhaps then she'd have a chance to bend his ear.
God willing, the Reverend replied.
God bless you, Reverend. Be well.
God bless you, sister. Goodbye.
Good citizens of New York, beware the lure of witchcraft. Do not let yourselves be fooled by those who say that witches are a thing of the past. Witchcraft is alive and well in America, thanks to a new order of witches who are eager to pull the unwitting, the curious, and the weak into their web of deceit. These are worrisome times, dear friends. Do not let the renewed workings of the devil take away what our forefathers fought so hard to secure. Sly in her approach, the new witch targets men and women alike. Whether dressed in the garb of the old country or in the fashion of everyday women, she is evil in disguise. Gentlemen, Do not let yourselves be enchanted by her flattering words. By the time you realize the destructive nature of your association, it will be too late. Ladies, do not be tempted to admire this foul creature, for you are her most valued prey. It is a witch's greatest triumph to lure God's daughters away from family, hearth, and home. How does she do it? By touting intelligence over righteousness, books of black magic over the Bible, superstition over faith, fashion over modesty, politics over prayer. Crafty in her dealings, she takes on many forms: the healer, the fortune-teller, the academic, the suffragist, the spiritualist, all in an effort to lead others astray. True women of God do not trouble themselves with such matters. True women of God know and obey His laws. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. The witches that plague our city must be rebuked and cast out. Come to the church of the Good Shepherd to hear His word. Learn of Satan's ways so we might prove victorious over him. Share your knowledge of evildoers so we may bring them into the light. Do not be afraid. The power of the Lord is on our side. All are welcome who seek the light. Reverend Francis Townsend. The known world is filled with mystical messages. Signs, portents, and foretellings come in many guises: smoke on the wind, sparks from a fire, ripples on the water, lines in the sand. If you wish to master magic, pay attention. If you wish to master love, do the same. The Grimoire of Eleanor St. Clair. Shop Talk and Secrets. Eleanor lit the wick on a small kerosene stove and watched the flame flicker and bloom in the heater's isinglass window. Filling a copper kettle, she placed it on the stove's iron rest and waited for the water to boil, and for the 3 women who were standing at her counter to make up their minds. "I quite like the hibiscus," the youngest woman remarked. "Doesn't it smell divine?" "Orange pekoe is my favorite," said the woman on her right. "You must try the Darjeeling," urged the woman to her left. Each of them had paid a recent visit to the shop, albeit alone and for very different reasons. Mrs. Orange Pekoe had been in search of a tonic to help her sleep, Madame Darjeeling had requested an elixir to foster desire, and Lady Hibiscus had required a tincture of Queen Anne's lace to clear the womb and restore peace of mind. This last pretty young woman was also the one responsible for Eleanor's broken heart. For a few blissful weeks in the spring, they'd carried on an affair, quietly hidden from the rest of the world, even Adelaide. All through the month of May, it had been flesh against flesh, honey sucked off fingers and breasts, silk sashes wrapped around wrists, feathers plucked from bonnets for tickling thighs and ribs. "This must remain a secret," Lady Hibiscus had insisted. "Just between us 2. She was promised to a gentleman of great social prominence and had no intention of breaking their engagement. Eleanor had thought she could stay level-headed, but being dismissed by the young woman had hurt more than she'd imagined. By June, the wedding was over and done, and the girl's affection had turned to calculated indifference. She insisted on coming into the shop for this and that, never giving so much as a nod to her former place in Eleanor's life. If that's what she wants, Eleanor had vowed to herself, so be it. But how was she to forget the girl when she kept turning up? There was at least one spell Eleanor knew that might well do the trick, but her mother's notes had indicated that it was a painful, drawn-out rite that should be attempted only as a last resort. Truth be told, she wasn't one for that sort of magic anyway. Instead, Eleanor had found a more pedestrian way of coping, working herself to exhaustion each day, so her heart had no choice but to give up the fight. As the trio of ladies took turns sniffing at open tea tins, Eleanor covered her mouth to stifle a yawn. Her sleep had been fitful and brief, especially after her dream, and before she'd known it, the sun had risen and it was time to drag her body from her bed. There'd been books to balance and remedies to concoct, linens to press and honeypots to fill. There'd been blessings to recite, spells to consider, and a pleasant exchange with Mr. Markowitz's son, a bright-natured boy named Isaac, who'd come to the door bearing a basket of baked goods to sell. Feeling generous, Eleanor had chosen to buy the whole lot: 3 glazed lemon tarts, 1 loaf of scalded rye, and an assortment of tea cakes, fritters, and biscuits, honey, apple, and buttermilk. Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor loved waking when most of the city's inhabitants, including Adelaide, were still asleep, and the only sounds on the sidewalk were the yappy bickering of newsboys and the cheerful swell of the milkman's voice singing a ditty as his wagon rolled by. This morning she'd even taken a few moments to sit on the roof amid the maze of potted herbs that surrounded her 2 small beehives and collect her thoughts. Everything in the humble potager had its beginnings in her mother's garden, from lemon balm to lavender, from mugwort to mint. Madame St. Clair had dubbed the garden and their little home l'Hermitage, gladly offering her services to the women of the surrounding countryside, as well as to a handful of apothecaries in the city. Once a month, she'd bundle Eleanor in blankets and paddle a little rowboat down the river to deliver bottles and jars of her concoctions. In time, Eleanor had become as much apprentice as daughter, happy to learn all she could about tinctures, elixirs, and the traditions of the cunning folk. As the first rays of morning sunlight hit the rooftop, a few keen bees had straggled forth from their hives. Soon, Eleanor had thought, all her golden beauties would be taking to the air to nuzzle among the late summer blooms of Madison Square, the last of the daylilies that surrounded the fountain in the park, the bright asters and pot marigolds that graced every flower box on Fifth Avenue, the hardy roses that climbed the trellises of the grand houses on Marble Row. Meanwhile, their sisters would commence their preparations for autumn's chill by capping their stores for winter and ridding themselves of anything that got in their way: failed eggs, lost wings, and every last one of their brothers, whose usefulness had come to an end. Crouching near a hive, Eleanor eavesdropped on the glorious, steady hum of their work. This and the heady scent of their honey never failed to make her worries disappear. Carrying this sense of contentment in her heart, she'd gone about her daily tasks with ease until the teapot had crashed to the floor. Oddly enough, she hadn't been standing anywhere near the pot when it fell. Only the lid had survived, sitting safe and untouched in the center of the counter. At Perdue's startled cries of, "Top off the pot! Top off the pot!" her mother's voice had sounded in her head.
Top off the pot means a stranger's coming to call.
Madame St. Clair had always put great faith in the happenstances that occurred while making, serving, and drinking tea. 2 spoons placed on the same saucer means a wedding will soon follow. 2 women pouring from the same pot means one will soon carry a child. Tea spilled from the spout of a carried pot means a secret will soon be revealed. Tea stirred while in the pot will surely stir up a quarrel. Eleanor wondered if her mother's sayings mattered anymore. The world was changing at an alarming pace, and the city right along with it. Perhaps all these changes called for a new sort of magic, one divined not from teacups and spoons, but from the rickety tick of the elevated trains as they roared past, or the flickering halos cast by the street lamps that stood outside her window. Something strange was in the air, she was sure of it, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. How was she supposed to understand what the city was trying to tell her when she couldn't properly remember her dreams? Closing her eyes, she tried once more to catch a glimpse of her most recent vision, but she only felt off balance and dizzy, as if she were about to fall from a great height. Had some dark specter come into the shop without her knowing? A ghost, a ghoul, a demon, the devil in disguise? She'd always been so careful to keep the place protected and safe. "Mère, aidez-moi," she whispered. "Mother, help me." "I can't decide." Madame Darjeeling said, shaking her head. Neither can I, Mrs. Orange Pico seconded. Nor can I, conceded Lady Hibiscus, sighing. Can't you? Eleanor thought. She really wanted to hate the young woman, but couldn't. She watched with concern as the newlywed nervously turned her wedding ring around her finger. Was something wrong? Why don't I brew a pot of each so you can sample them all? She suggested. My treat. That would be lovely, said Madame Darjeeling. Simply splendid, remarked Mrs. Orange Pico. If it's not any trouble, Lady Hibiscus added. As Eleanor set the tea to steep, a single honeybee clung fast to a fold in her sleeve. Perdu, watching intently from his perch, spotted the bee before his mistress. Flapping his wings, he bobbed his head and exclaimed, Treat! 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 Mrs. Orange Pico's eyes went wide with disbelief. Was that the bird? She asked. Lady Hibiscus smiled and nodded. I've heard him speak before. What a clever trick, exclaimed Madame Darjeeling. Holding a bit of tea cake in the palm of her hand, Eleanor offered it to Perdu. What's gotten into you? She whispered. You're acting like a spoiled brat. The bird refused to take the sweet. Eleanor ignored her pet's antics and resumed the work of preparing the tea. Why don't you ladies take a seat? It'll only be a minute. Perdu hopped to the counter and took hold of her sleeve with his beak. He knew what he wanted, even if she didn't. The bee, enticed by a pitcher of honey Eleanor had placed on the counter, crawled out of hiding and moved toward her hand. Well, hello, my dear, Eleanor said, spotting the object of Perdu's desire. Treat, Perdu demanded again. She's not for you, Eleanor scolded, moving out of his reach. Had it been a drone, she might well have handed the doomed creature over to the raven to gobble up, but this bee was no drone. She was a healthy female, meant to be rushing from flower to flower in the last days of harvest. Knowing the ruckus the little darling would cause if she happened to get tangled in Lady Hibiscus's curls, Eleanor poured a single drop of honey onto a saucer, gently transferred the bee alongside it, and covered them both with an empty, upturned cup. For a moment the bee bumped and buzzed against the porcelain in protest, but as soon as Eleanor bent near the cup and whispered, Patience, my dear, you'll soon be free, she stopped. Perdu returned to his perch to sulk. Amid a collection of Moroccan lanterns, tasseled pillows, and tufted furniture, Adelaide was sitting in the far back corner of the shop, taking advantage of a brief lull in her mourning. She'd been holding court since 9:30, turning cards and entertaining questions from a steady stream of clients. Miss Edith Jones, a dear, bright girl, always on time. She came in blushing, fidgeting, heart aflutter, crossed her legs at the ankles, once, twice, 3 times over, so keen to fall in love. Her question? Is he the one? Her cards? Courtship, jealousy, disappointment. Adelaide's answer? He thinks he is, but his mother does not. The mother of the he in question was Mrs. Marietta Stevens, socialite, widow, owner of the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and someone Adelaide was eager to do more business with. She'd visited the shop the previous day for her own consultation, during which she'd heartily complained of Miss Jones's pursuit of her son and of the hotel's growing notoriety as a favorite haunt of ghosts. More concerned with Miss Jones than the ghosts, she'd repeatedly asked if she might eventually find success in breaking up the pair. All signs had pointed to yes. What a pity, Adelaide had thought. Edith is such a lovely girl. Mrs. Violet Pritchett, newlywed, face aglow, dress hugging her figure, downed 2 cups of peppermint tea in quick succession, complained of shoes feeling tight and of stiff, swollen fingers. Her question? When shall I get with child? Her cards? Fortune, plenty, home. Adelaide's answer? Congratulations, my dear, you already are. Mrs. Rose Blanchard, nervous, quiet, eyes downcast. Every time she moved, the right cuff of her dress shifted, revealing a ring of dark bruises on her wrist. Her question? When will it end? Her cards? Deceit, ruin, death. Adelaide's answer? Not until you leave him, or he's dead. Mrs. Blanchard's response? It's easier to kill a man than to divorce him, I'd guess. Adelaide thought that she'd like to kill the woman's husband herself if she could get away with it. Perhaps she could pose as a housemaid and slip the powder of some noxious root from Eleanor's cupboard into his coffee. But, alas, it would never work. How could she slip past anyone with a face like hers? Until she could think of a better plan, poor Mrs. Blanchard would have to go it alone. Checking her watch, Adelaide saw it was 5 past noon. The prospective shopgirls would be arriving in less than an hour. She knew that she should inform Eleanor. Her partner hated surprises, even when they were good. Shuffling her cards, Adelaide posed a question of her own in hopes the answer might direct her to do what she wished rather than what she should. Miss Adelaide Tom, hopeful, confident, impeccably dressed, holds her impatience in check with the steady tap of her left foot. Her question? What will Eleanor think of me if I don't tell her? Her cards? Falsehood, treachery, the judge. Her answer? Nothing good. Picking up the cards, Adelaide shuffled them back into the deck as quickly as she could. As with her sitters, they had served to remind her of what she'd already supposed. She didn't need them to discern the truth, but having them near certainly didn't hurt her judgment. By turns, they gave her courage to say what needed to be said, or admonished her to stay quiet when she might have been inclined to speak too freely. Frayed and worn at the edges, they'd come from another era, each card holding an artful illustration of a mythical scene or figure skirted by a word or two of description written in a shaky hand. The reverse of each card had been decorated with a curious symbol, a flaming heart entwined in the grip of 2 snakes. When Eleanor had first seen the cards, she'd asked all sorts of questions. Where did they come from? Has anyone blessed them? Are they enchanted? If so, by what order of magic? All Adelaide could say was that they'd been left for her long ago at the ticket booth of Mr. Dink's sideshow with a note that had simply read, "From an admirer." Since the loss of her eye, she'd been especially grateful to have them, as they gave her sitters something to gaze upon other than her face. Not a day went by without someone trying to get a better look at what she hid behind her veil. Slipping the cards inside her pocket, she checked her watch again. 20 after 12. Time's a-wastin', Adelaide. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Approaching Eleanor, she sweetly said, Sorry, I forgot to wind the clock. I would have done it myself, Eleanor replied, but I couldn't find the key. You couldn't? Adelaide asked. That's strange. I left it where I always do, inside your favorite teapot. The pot is no more. With a nod, Adelaide said, So that was the crash I heard. I'm sorry for that, too. Did you leave it out on the counter? The clock key? No, the teapot. Why would I? What are you getting at? You were out so late. Where were you, by the way? Here and there, no place special. I see. I wasn't drunk and I didn't touch your teapot. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. It's just you look a little worse for wear. I do? Only in the way that I can see. Don't worry, no one else can tell. Staring at her reflection in the mirror behind the counter, Adelaide turned her head first to the right and then to the left. As she leaned forward to get a better look, she felt a sharp, nagging twinge of pain. Over time, she'd come to accept her scars, but the pain always caught her by surprise. It had been a month since her last bout, and she'd even begun to hope that perhaps she might be rid of it at last. If only she had some way of predicting when it was coming and how long it would last. If it had to persist, it could at least be of some use, warning her of impending danger or of the incoming presence of insufferable company at the very least. Give it time, Eleanor had advised. It may prove useful yet. One could hope, one could pray, one could wish. Cup of tea? Eleanor asked, staring at Adelaide with concern. Thank you, yes. Willow bark? That would be good. Eleanor could always tell when the pain was with her. As she turned to her herbs, Adelaide took a deep breath. It's now or never, she thought. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." "What's that?" Eleanor asked. "Promise you won't get angry?" Eleanor sighed. "It was you who misplaced the pot, wasn't it? Honestly, Adelaide, I wouldn't be half so displeased if you just confessed it from the start." Just then, the bells above the door jangled, announcing the arrival of another customer. Perdue glanced up from his perch and then resumed his sulking over the loss of the bee. The three ladies sitting in the window seat turned to stare, taking a brief, nosy pause before continuing their discussion of the impending resurgence of the bustle. When Adelaide turned and spied the woman standing in the doorway, she abandoned her conversation with Eleanor. "Mrs. Dashley," she said, advancing on her with open arms. "Miss Tom," Judith Dashley replied, enthusiastically kissing the air on either side of Adelaide's cheeks. Lace parasol in hand, pearls at her bosom, she was a perfect specimen of a Fifth Avenue femme, a true New York lady. She was also Adelaide's best customer, coming to the shop for tea and divinations every day of the week throughout the season, except Sundays. This was her first visit since she'd returned to town after her summer in the country, and Adelaide had high hopes that they'd resume their previous schedule. If the lady wished to consult the cards on a regular basis, who was she to say no? "I trust your holiday agreed with you," Adelaide said. "You look radiant." "You flatter me," Judith replied with a blush. "I speak only the truth," Adelaide said. "It's my gift as well as my curse." "Trust me, my dear, it's the city that's put a spring in my step. That, and getting away from the damnable scenic riverfront at Tarrytown. The place was simply crawling with catchpenny girls come by steamboat from the city, hoping to land themselves a rich lad. Oh, to be young and free and taut and firm, and to have more life ahead than not." Jutting out her chin ever so slightly, she forced a small pucker of crepey wrinkles to disappear from her neck. "I'm sure when they caught sight of you, they were sick with envy. I'm sure they didn't give me a second thought. You underestimate the impression that earned beauty can make. Whether or not, I'm thrilled to be back in your company. Alden returned a fortnight ago, so I was stuck playing whist with a tiresome circle of Tarrytown hens. The cottage was starting to feel more like a barnyard than a retreat. You must be glad to be home at Marble Row." "I'm back, yes, but not exactly at home. The house is being refurbished and won't be finished until the new year. Alden and I are staying in a suite at the Fifth Avenue Hotel for the duration. Some say the hotel's decor is passé, but I don't mind it a bit. Call me old-fashioned, but I feel it fits the history of the place." Lowering her voice, she gleefully added, "You know, they say it's haunted." "Do they really?" Adelaide replied, thinking back to Mrs. Stevens's concerns over the hotel's reputation for ghosts. "That they do." "Care to sit?" Adelaide suggested. "Oh, yes, please," Judith replied. Leading Judith to her secluded corner in the back of the room, Adelaide said, "Make yourself comfortable. I'll fetch the tea. I can't wait to hear about the socialites and specters you've encountered at the hotel thus far." Aside from liking Judith's money, Adelaide had grown quite fond of the woman herself. They'd met at a psychic demonstration featuring a medium who called herself Mrs. Saunders and her spirit guide, Little Moon. As Mrs. Saunders had prattled on, eyes rolling back in her head, purportedly possessed by her guide, Adelaide had noticed that the woman seated next to her in the darkened theater was holding back tears. In an attempt to comfort her, Adelaide had leaned close and whispered, "None of this is real." The stricken woman had whispered back, "Don't you believe? In ghosts, yes. In this dog and pony show, no. Have you ever seen a ghost?" "Possibly, yes. Have you?" "Once, I think. It was the spirit of my dear son, Billy, staring up at me from the bottom of a silver fruit bowl. He died when he was only 7. Placing her hand on the woman's arm, Adelaide had said, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Have you lost someone too? Is that why you're here?" "My mother, when I was just a girl." "Oh, heavens, that's awful." the woman had remarked, putting her hand to her mouth. Adelaide hadn't been sure if the woman was reacting to her loss or the scars on her face. Still, she'd handed the woman her calling card and said, "In case you ever find yourself with a yearning to peer into the future." The next morning, Judith Dashley had come to the tea shop and requested a meeting with Adelaide. "I think I need a little respite from chasing the dead," she'd said. "I'd like to turn my attention to the business of living. Can you give me any advice on how to do that?" "What shall it be today?" Adelaide asked as she poured tea into Judith's cup. "Your usual consultation?" Judith stirred in a splash of milk. "Actually," she said, biting her lip, "I'm here to give you some news." "Color me curious." Leaning forward, Judith said, "I've someone who wishes to meet you." "Any friend of yours is a friend of mine. Tell her to come to the shop and to mention your name. I'll be sure to put her at the top of my list." Lowering her eyes, Judith shook her head and said, "I can't." "Why ever not?" Adelaide asked. Blushing, Judith answered, "Because it's not a she, but a he." Now it all made sense. Judith's hemming and hawing, her schoolgirl blush. Whoever he was, Judith Dashley was smitten. Had she been unfaithful to her husband? No, not yet. She showed no signs of that. None of the excuse-laden talk that accompanies guilt, or the all-too upright posture of infidelity. With a teasing laugh, Adelaide asked, "He's quite handsome then, Glancing to the side, Judith measured the memory of him from shoes to hat with her eyes. "Oh, yes." "And tall, too," Adelaide pressed. "And not of your family." "Why do I bother thinking anything could come as a surprise to you?" Judith exclaimed. "What a gift you have! How I wish I could do the same." "Careful what you wish for," Adelaide said with a smile. "Now, why don't you tell me why this mystery man wishes to meet me, or do I have to guess that as well? You know I don't suffer salesmen, preachers, or politicians, so if he's one of those, you needn't bother." "He's a doctor," Judith said, "and highly regarded." Resisting the urge to touch her scars, Adelaide asked, "What kind of doctor?" Handsome or not, she'd been poked, prodded, and examined enough. "He's an alienist," Judith explained. "A doctor of the mind. He's keenly interested in studying the way women think and something he calls intuitive inclination. Alden was a long-time acquaintance of his father's, God rest the gentleman's soul, but I only met him for the first time when we dined together last night. He's been away in Paris, furthering his studies, but he recently came back to the city to settle his father's estate. Alden has asked him to speak at the annual conference of the Fraternal Order of the Unknown Philosophers. Isn't that exciting?" "Just," Adelaide said. "When I told him of your gifts, he begged me to arrange a meeting as soon as possible. He's such a charming fellow, I simply couldn't say no. Will you meet with him?" "Only if you tell me his name," Adelaide replied. "Oh yes, I suppose I should do that. It's Dr. Quinn Brody." "Shall we try for tomorrow morning, then? Say 10:30 at the hotel?" 10:30 it is," Judith replied with a smile. Raising her teacup, she added, "Here's to intuitive inclination." Shortly after Judith's departure, the three ladies in the window seat also took their leave. As Eleanor cleared their table, she discovered that each of them had tucked a calling card, on which they'd written a note beneath their saucers. Mrs. Orange Pico's card read, "More of the same, please, sent to this address." Madame Darjeeling's card simply said, "Success." Lady Hibiscus's note was more pressing. "I must speak with you soon, in private." Eleanor upended her former lover's cup on its saucer and turned it 3 times. Writing it, she peered into the bowl to inspect the leaves. Her mother would never have done such a thing without the tea drinker's consent, but in light of their past and the urgent tone of the young woman's note, Eleanor felt she was in the right. Eyes half closed, she gazed at the shapes of the leaves until they formed a series of images in her mind. First an apple, then a snake, then a broken quill. An affair of the heart gone wrong, a couple divided. Running out the door, Eleanor stared down the street in the direction Lady Hibiscus had turned, hoping the woman might still be nearby. Sadly, she was out of sight. As she turned to go back inside, she saw that a long line of young women had formed outside the shop. The girl at the head of the line stepped forward and asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, is it time?" "Time for what?" Eleanor said. "For considering the new girl to work in your shop?" "Whatever gave you that idea? You must have the wrong address." Pointing to the sign above the door, the girl asked, "Ain't this St. Clair and Tom's tea shop?" "It is, but we're not looking to hire anyone." The girl stepped forward to press a square of newsprint into Eleanor's hand. "The paper said you is." Without even a glance at the paper, Eleanor said, "I'm sorry, but it's a mistake." Staring pointedly at the ever-growing queue, she gave the girl a curt nod and said, "Pass it down the line." Back inside the shop, Eleanor locked the door and turned the sign in the window to closed. "Adelaide," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "What was it you wanted to tell me?" As Adelaide came toward her, struggling to find the right words, Perdue threw back his feathered head and squawked, "Top off the pot! Top off the pot!" Adelaide laughed. Eleanor did not. Adelaide looked out the window in time to see the last of the prospective shopgirls disperse. Hand on the doorknob, she thought she might chase after them so the day wouldn't be a complete bust. "Don't," Eleanor said, eyes narrowed. Adelaide threw up her hands. "I was only trying to help. You were only thinking of yourself. How is hiring an assistant for you thinking of myself?" Eleanor was tired, fragile, fed up, and worried about what she'd seen in the cup. "You act on every whim that pops into your head without thinking of the consequences. Did it ever occur to you that I might like a say in the matter?" Adelaide bit her lip. She couldn't recall ever seeing her friend react quite like this. Eleanor pressed on. "I'm sure it didn't, because it never does." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just look around this place," Eleanor said, gesturing toward Adelaide's corner. As of late, her taste in decor had begun to spill over into the rest of the shop. A gilded mirror here, a pair of velvet curtains there. The last time the landlord had come by, he'd spied Adelaide's treasures, whistled through his teeth, and then threatened to raise the rent. "It's starting to look more like a bordello than a tea shop." The remark stung, but Adelaide didn't take the bait. She sensed that Eleanor's words, though pointed and somewhat true, were hiding a deeper anger, one she hoped was meant for someone else. Arguing would make matters only worse. Shrugging into a wrap, she announced, "I'm going out." "Of course you are," Eleanor muttered, fetching her gripsack from behind the counter. Then, as Adelaide went through the door, she said, "I hope you have your key, because I'm going out as well and I can't say when I'll be back." The two witches went their separate ways, Adelaide storming off toward the park, Eleanor marching with gripsack in hand to search for her lost lover.